Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to speak to my bill, C-377, entitled An Act to Amend the Income Tax Act, Labour Organizations. Labour organizations play a valuable role in Canadian society, representing and defending the rights of workers. 4,300,000 Canadiens sont actuellement membres d'un syndicat et des millions d'autres l'ont été durant leur carrière professionnelle. There are thousands of Canadians in my riding of South Surrey, White Rock, Cloverdale, in British Columbia, who currently pay dues to labour organizations. Because of the valuable role unions play in the lives of many Canadians, our federal tax system has provided benefits to support the work that unions do. Key among those benefits is a 100% tax deductibility for the union dues that workers pay, and tax-exempt status for the labour organizations themselves. To put the value of the dues deductibility alone into perspective, consider that the federal government forgoes $795 million in tax revenue each year for union and professional dues, the majority of which is claimed by union members, probably in the range of $400 to $500 million. This is a substantial public benefit, Mr. Speaker. And because there is a substantial public benefit, I believe it is only right for the public to know how that money is being spent. Therefore, my bill will require the public disclosure of the finances of labour organizations. Cette mesure va dans le même sens que la transparence accrue que nous avons exigée des ministères, des organismes publics et des réserves autochtones. Elle va dans le même sens que la déclaration publique exigée de la part d'autres institutions de la société canadienne qui profitent d'un soutien public substantiel. For instance, Mr. Speaker, public disclosure has been required for Canadian charities since 1977. The filings of charities are easy for any Canadian to find on the Canada Revenue Agency's website. I have based my requirements for public disclosure for labour organizations on the long existing provisions for charities in the Income Tax Act. With the passage of this bill, the public will be empowered to gauge the effectiveness, financial integrity, and health of any labour union. And this is something that Canadians want, Mr. Speaker. According to a Nanos poll taken on Labour Day of last year, 83% of Canadians, and even more union members, 86%, want public financial disclosure for unions. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to run through the various provisions in the bill. Clause 1 is the heart of the bill and can be considered in three parts. First, there are three new definitions offered to give greater clarity to terms already used or proposed in the bill for use. They are labour organizations, labour relations activities, and labour trust. Second, come the lengthiest part of the bill, the statements of income and expenditures that must be submitted annually to the Revenue Minister by labour organizations. J'ai reçu de nombreux avis sur la déclaration qui illustrera le mieux la façon dont les syndicats font profiter leurs membres de leurs avantages publics. Il est clair que la liste de déclarations est fort longue. Cela reflète la nature finance souvent complexe de organisations syndicales et la grande variété d'activités qu'ils entreprennent pour représenter et servir leurs membres. Among these activities may be organizing, collective bargaining, education and training, and conferences, as well as political activities and lobbying. The required statements also include disbursements to directors and to staff. As Jim Stafford, economist for the Canadian Auto Workers, recently pointed out, these figures are something that the CAW already publishes. I believe that this level of detailed public disclosure will increase the confidence that Canadians have that the public subsidy for labour organizations is warranted. Thirdly, Subclause 4 requires that the information submitted be made available to the public by the Minister, including posting on the Canada Revenue Agency website. Finally, and most importantly, Clause 3 would have this Act come into force 6 months following royal assent. Since announcing this bill last fall, it's been interesting to receive feedback from various sources, including union leaders themselves. First, A comment from Lorona Lewis, president of the Association of Graduate Students Employed at McGill, representing over 3,000 employees. She says her union already publicly discloses. She says, quote, "You can go online to look to see what was spent, when it was spent, and so on," end quote. And she says transparency is, quote, "something we believe in anyway." Ken Giorgetti, president of the Canadian Labour Congress, sees things a little differently. He agrees with public disclosure generally, saying, and I quote, "We're not opposed to transparency. We're more than happy to supply Mr. Hiebert or anyone else with our financial statements and our balance sheets as corporations file," end of quote. However, he goes on to say that because my bill asks for somewhat more detail than is currently asked for from other institutions, in his words, "it's not fair and it's not equal," end quote. Well, I appreciate Mr. Giorgetti's point, and he may be quite correct that it's time to review the public disclosure requirements that other types of institutions receiving public benefits face and determine if they also need improving. I note with interest that the Finance Committee is currently looking at the very question of increasing the level of transparency for charities. However, this private members bill deals specifically with labor organizations which have never been subject to public disclosure, unlike charities, for instance, that have been subject to public disclosure for over 35 years now. Mr. Giorgetti also raises a concern that this bill may be costly for unions to comply with. I disagree for 3 reasons. First, unions already file detailed financial returns with the CRA, including much of the information that will be required by this bill. This is a point Mr. Giorgetti himself has acknowledged. Second, this bill does not require audited statements. Therefore, filing will not impose any additional outside expense on labor organizations, and the filing can generally be prepared by their own bookkeeping or financial personnel. Finally, because of bookkeeping software and the possibility for electronic filing, the cost of compliance with these sorts of filing requirements has dropped considerably from where it might have been in generations past. De même, le coût de la production de documents pourra être minime pour le gouvernement, une fois que seront établis le système de production électronique, la base de données et le site web pour cela. Members do not have to take it on faith, though, Mr. Speaker. As you know, we have an independent and qualified watchdog in place in the form of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, who now examines private members' bills and gives feedback on their estimated costs. I believe that the PBO's analysis will confirm that this bill will not create significant costs to the government. The comments from other Canadians are also interesting. A columnist for the Windsor Star, a strong union town, is supportive of the bill and only regrets that it is not retroactive, as he would like to see how his union dues have been spent in the past as well. The communications director of the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees, David Klemenhaga, says of unions, and I quote, "Many publish their complete audited financial statements, in spite of the fact that it is not required by law, and distribute them to 100% of their membership. Any member of the public, of course, may access that information. Such complete openness seems to do them no harm," end quote. Mr. Klemenhaga suggests that the same level of transparency be extended to think tanks and private corporations that benefit from tax breaks and subsidies. Of course, Mr. Speaker, it is usually the case that the private member, introducing a private member's bill, is granted the privilege of introducing and speaking to his or her bill before any other members. Unfortunately, as members will be aware, the member for Windsor-Tecumseh decided to jump the gun and start the debate before this allotted hour under the guise of a point of order. Despite the positive comments of various union leaders, union members, and others that I have just referenced, the NDP House Leader suggested last fall in debating my earlier bill that he is very disturbed by the idea of public accountability for labor organizations. He stated that this bill is a matter of ideology. Well, I would ask him, was the introduction of public disclosure for charities way back in 1977, 35 years ago, a matter of ideology? Mr. Speaker, if there is an ideology, it is based on the principle that organizations that receive public benefits should be accountable to those to disclose how they use those benefits. Does the member believe that charities should no longer have to publicly disclose their spending? And what about government departments, crown corporations, or even members of parliament? Where does his opposition to this bill logically lead? As I stated earlier, I also believe that public disclosure will increase the confidence that Canadians have that the several $100 million in public benefits that they provide to unions each year is money well spent. Does the NDP not agree that public disclosure will indeed prove this fact? Further, the member complained about the additional cost he believes that disclosure will cause unions to incur. As I mentioned, using tax software and electronic filing, the costs to labor organizations will be quite minimal. But it's important to remember that filing is not a new activity for unions. Unions already file tax returns each year, and much of the information proposed to be collected under this bill is already required. The difference, of course, is that this information will be made public. But that difference alone creates no cost for labor organizations. The member has raised the concern that the filing requirement may be onerous for small locals of perhaps a few dozen members. Again, not so. Small locals are by definition small spenders and may not have spent anything in several of the categories mentioned in the bill. What can be easier than putting a zero on several pages of an electronic form? I believe that the experience of charities over the last 35 years is instructive. The process has not bogged down charities, which, unlike unions, are often run by volunteers alone, nor has it cost them significant sums of money. And the same will be true for labor organizations. Mr. Speaker, the debate on this bill is just getting underway. Some have already taken a position on it, but I would encourage those who have already stated opposition to the bill to consider the following facts. The bill does not tell union leaders how to spend their money or restrict them in any way. The bill does not place a substantial burden or expense on unions. Unions are already engaged in responsible accounting of their finances. Many unions are already publicly reporting this financial information to members and others. And finally, all unions are already filing much of this information with the Canada Revenue Agency through their tax returns. Tout ce que fait le projet de loi, c'est exiger que l'information présentée soit rendue publique. Encore une fois, le public veut savoir comment est utilisé l'avantage public accordé aux syndicats. And I believe that asking for that type of transparency is legitimate. Mr. Speaker, both the public and MPs can learn more about this bill on a dedicated website that I've set up, and the address is www.c377.ca. I would encourage all members of this House to consider the merits of this bill and support it going forward for further study at committee. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député d'Acadie-Bathurst.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member for South Surrey, White Rock, Cloverdale is saying that this will not, with all the new technology, will not cost anything. Well, with the new technology, I wonder why is the Conservative Party got rid of the gun registry, because it was one of the big problems. It seems to be they didn't have the technology that it didn't cost much. They said it cost too much to taxpayer. And in this bill here, say it doesn't cost anything. No. Okay? Even the Fraser Institute say hardworking women and men pay into their labor organization to protect and advance their rights in the workplace and in society. The time and money allocated to those unless report, according to the Fraser Institute, will be money not spent by labor organizations to defend workers against bad, profitable international businesses such as Caterpillar and Rio Tinto. And what about all the money and the tax break that this government, the Conservative government, give to the oil company, give to the bank company, that they give tax release, and they don't have to report to the grand public the money that they do get by the taxpayer. Then I'm wondering where this member, Mr. Speaker, is taking his facts and only taking the side of big business and going against the labor movement, the one that defends the worker and have collective agreement.
Order. The honourable member for South Surrey, White Rock, Cloverdale.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I'm baffled at the opposition of the NDP to this bill. Not only do unions already have the means to collect this information, and not only are they already submitting it to the CRA, that's why there's no additional cost to the unions to do this. But it gets more to the point. He's making the suggestion that myself or my party are somehow against union members or union organizations, and that's simply not the case at all, Mr. Speaker. It's my belief that this bill will actually increase the confidence that Canadians have in labor organizations, because they will see the value that is produced by these institutions, and that the money is well spent. And I can tell, as I said to the member earlier in my speech, 83% of Canadians want this information. 86% of union members polled want this information, and the number is even higher in Quebec, where I've done much media, and the Quebec media in particular is very supportive of this initiative.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the member's comments, but the first thing that comes to my mind is, as the government is kind of focused on trying to target the union movement across Canada, that the public, on the other hand, are concerned in terms of the whole issue of transparency, something that this member talked a lot about, public transparency. Would he not believe the same principles of public transparency that he's advocating for unions and so forth should actually apply to things such as the Prime Minister's office? To what degree does he believe the Prime Minister's office should be more transparent with what's taking place inside that office?
The honourable member for South Surrey, White Rock, Cloverdale.
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, as I pointed out in my remarks, I do believe in public disclosure, and I do in fact believe that perhaps other institutions that receive substantial public benefits should be evaluated in terms of the amount of disclosure that they require. But as a private member's bill, I'm limited to what I can cover, and that's why I've chosen this particular topic. But I mean, I'm open to the question as to whether or not other organizations that receive public benefits, like charities, should also be required to disclose.
Questions, comments? A short question, the honourable member for Chatham-Kent, Essex.
Thank you, Chair. I guess my question is, and this is something that has to be addressed, is this bill designed to attack the NDP? And is it part of the government's campaign against union donations to the NDP convention?
The honourable member for South Surrey, White Rock, Cloverdale. Short answer, please.
Sure. Well, this came up early on when I introduced the bill, and the reality is that this is a private member's bill. It's not a government bill. I started working on this bill more than a year ago. I started drafting it in June of last year, and so any suggestion that this is part of some, anything other than my own initiative is simply false.
Resuming